On July the 7th, 2005, London found itself directly in the line of fire in the war on terror.
Suddenly, there was a massive explosion, really big. People screamed, lights went out in all the carriages, it was filled with smoke, and everything just went deadly silent for a few seconds. People didn't know what the hell had happened. There was a pregnant woman on the tube.
Eventually, everyone starts collecting themselves and trying to stay low and cover their faces. And we hear a woman screaming. I couldn't really tell which way it was from, but everyone sort of saying, calm down, you know, like sort of, you're not helping. But obviously, by the sounds of it, she must have been in a carriage full of bodies or something.
Suicide bombers targeted 3 trains on the Piccadilly and Circle lines, striking at the busiest time of the morning. With an unknown number of deaths and hundreds of injured, London's emergency services snapped into action and rushed survivors to hospital. Those who could and left on foot, traumatized and still in shock at their close call with death. But an hour later, it happened again. A red double-decker bus traveling from Marble Arch to Hackney had been diverted through Tavistock Square because of road closures around the tube stations. Suddenly, a huge blast ripped through the bus. One witness described a massive explosion that sent half a bus sailing through the air. 13 people, including the bomber, were killed. More than 100 were injured. At first, it was assumed that the religious extremists who carried out the acts were Al-Qaeda operatives from the Middle East. But soon Britons were confronted with the horrifying fact that the 4 young men who killed themselves and 52 others were born and raised in England. They were identified as Shahad Tanweer from Leeds, who killed 7 people on the Aldgate train. Hazib Hussain, who also lived in Leeds and killed 13 people in the Tavistock Square bus bombing. Ringleader Mohammed Siddiq Khan from Dewsbury, who died in the Edgware Road subway attack that killed 7. And an unknown man later identified as 19-year-old Jermaine Lindsay of Buckinghamshire, who caused the deaths of 25 people near King's Cross Station. The men's activities came as a terrible shock to Britain's Asian community, as the bombers came from unremarkable, non-militant families and had been schooled in secular government schools. But one by one, they'd secretly fallen under the spell of militant Islam, with Khan, Tanweer and Hussain known to have traveled to Pakistan.
We do know that he'd been to Pakistan. You said he'd been taking part in religious studies out there, and that was very recently, yes?
That's very recent.
That was the end of last year and the beginning of this year.
That's the end of last year, beginning of this year. That's the end of his life by look of it.
Did you see any change in him when you came back?
Nope.
Fear gripped London, with many people avoiding public transport after the bombings. 2 weeks later, it seemed this reaction was justified when 3 explosions rocked trains on the Underground and a bomb exploded on a double-decker bus. Fortunately, no one was injured, as detonator caps rather than the bombs themselves caused the explosions. A strange smell observed by witnesses raised fears of a chemical attack, but it was later confirmed that the smell came from the hydrogen peroxide used to create the devices.
People were panicking and that. It was like a very bad smell coming from the train, but I never seen any, no explosion myself, but I still thought everyone was going to die on it. People was told not to panic, but everyone was panicking.
London's transport system was brought to a standstill.
There's been an explosion, and that, in fact, that has happened somewhere between Ladbroke Grove and Hammersmith on the Hammersmith and City line.
The homemade bombs were quite amateurish, and eyewitnesses reported one suspect firing a handgun at a device to try and activate it. But police were unsure whether the attacks were related to the July 7 bombings and pursued thousands of leads in an attempt to discover those responsible.
Bombs appear to be smaller than on the last occasion, but we don't know the implications of all this yet.
With tensions high, police were under pressure to prevent any further attacks, which led to a tragic mistake. On the alert for a dark-featured man suspected of planting a bomb the previous day, police chased a man into a train at Stockwell Tube Station.
Yeah, I was sitting on the tube train. It hadn't pulled out of the station at this time, the doors were still open. I heard a lot of shouting, "Get down, get out." I looked to my right, I saw a chap run onto the train, Asian guy. He ran onto the train, he was running so fast he half sort of tripped, but he was being pursued by 3 guys. One had a black handgun in his hand, left hand, and as he sort of went down, 2 of them sort of dropped onto him to hold him down, and the other one fired. I heard 5 shots.
But instead of a suicide bomber, police had mistakenly killed Jean-Charles de Menezes, a Brazilian national who had no connection to the bombings. Scotland Yard released a statement acknowledging the error. For someone to lose their life in such circumstances is a tragedy, and one that the Metropolitan Police Service regrets.
This is a very disturbing aspect, particularly for Muslims, because they will now feel that if they are suspects, then the same thing might happen to them. And I believe it has a knock-on effect on getting them to cooperate with the security services.
The next day, an unexploded bomb was found near Wormwood Scrubs, and police descended on the area in full force to apprehend some suspects. The men they were after were West African-born Britons who had become followers of militant Islam and were suspected of training overseas with Al-Qaeda. Ramzi Mohammed, later convicted of the attempted bombing at Oval Tube Station, and Muqta Saeed Ibrahim, who was convicted of the attempted bombing of number 26 bus, barricaded themselves into their flat. Tearful residents waited for news of their families who were trapped by the police cordon. Shots were heard, although they were later found to be tear gas rounds fired by police. Police shouted to the men to give themselves up, and eventually they appeared on the balcony. Together with their accomplices, the men were found guilty of the attempted bombings and sentenced to 40 years jail. The court heard that the bombings had been planned for some time and were not a hastily arranged copycat operation. After the bombings, Londoners resumed their normal lives, but for many, the terror of July 2005 will never be forgotten.